Why did an entire order of knights get erased in a single morning? It wasn't only gold, it wasn't only envy, it wasn't only a king who owed them more than he could ever repay. It was nearly 200 years of power, ended by one carefully planned dawn. They were tortured, burned alive, accused of heresy. They almost certainly never practiced. But why them? What made an order of warrior monks dangerous enough to destroy completely, down to the last man? This story starts with a crusade. It ends with a curse. Part 1. The Order Born from War. In the winter of 1119, 9 men kneel in a chapel in Jerusalem and take a vow that will, in one form or another, outlive every empire that currently exists on earth. They do not know this, of course. They know only that the roads outside the city are killing pilgrims by the hundreds, Christians who have crossed an entire continent to see the place where their faith was born, only to be robbed, murdered, or dragged into slavery on the final stretch of a journey that has already taken most of them a year or more. Jerusalem itself, since its capture 20 years earlier, is reasonably secure. Everything beyond its walls is not. Bandits control the roads to the coast. Nobody with real military power has thought it worthwhile to fix this. A pilgrim's death is not, to the great lords of the Crusader kingdoms, a strategic problem. It is a problem to a French knight named Hugues de Payens. Little enough is known about de Payens before this moment that historians still argue over basic details of his life, where exactly in Champagne he was born, precisely how he was connected to the region's ruling count, what he had actually been doing in the years since the First Crusade ended. What is agreed upon is this: he gathers 8 companions, most of them relatives by blood or marriage, and together they approach King Baldwin II of Jerusalem with an unusual proposal. Not a private security company, not a mercenary band, but something that does not yet have a name or a precedent. Men who will live as monks, bound by vows of poverty and obedience and chastity, and yet also fight, killing when necessary, in defense of the pilgrim road. The idea of a warrior who is also a monk should, by the theological standards of the time, be a contradiction. Monks renounce the world. Killing is a sin requiring penance, not a vocation. And yet Baldwin says yes almost immediately, and gives them something considerably more valuable than his blessing: living quarters inside his own palace on the Temple Mount, in a repurposed mosque, built on the site medieval Christians believe to be the ruins of the Temple of Solomon itself. From this address, not from any grander design, the 9 knights take the name that will follow them for the next 2 centuries. The Knights of the Temple, and then, for the better part of a decade, they almost entirely disappear from the historical record. This is one of the strangest gaps in the Order's early history, and one that later centuries will fill with increasingly elaborate speculation. 9 men, all of them past their first youth, are supposedly protecting a road traveled by thousands of pilgrims a year, and yet there is no surviving account of them actually doing this. No chronicle mentions Templar escorts. No pilgrim's diary records being saved by one. What the historical record does show, much later, is considerably stranger. 19th century excavations beneath the Temple Mount uncovered tunnels extending vertically for some 25 meters before fanning out horizontally beneath the old temple site. Tunnels that produced Templar spurs and pieces of armament as evidence of who had dug them. 9 knights, ostensibly guarding a dangerous road, apparently spent a significant portion of their first decade underground, in the dark, digging. Nobody knows, with any real certainty, what they were looking for. Whether they found it is a question historians generally decline to answer at all, on the reasonable grounds that there is no evidence either way. Only a tunnel and the tools of men who are supposed to have been somewhere else entirely. What changes their fortunes permanently is not the digging. It is a journey Hugues de Payens makes across Europe in 1127, seeking money, men, and above all legitimacy for an order that still exists in an uncomfortable legal and theological grey area. He finds an unlikely champion in Bernard of Clairvaux, a Cistercian abbot who is, by a considerable margin, the most influential religious voice in Western Christendom, a man whose opinion can make or unmake careers, doctrines, and occasionally kings. Bernard is also not incidentally related by blood to one of the 9 founding knights, a connection that historians studying the Order's rapid rise have never entirely been able to separate from the timing of what happens next. Bernard writes the Templars, a rule, 72 clauses, governing everything from how many horses a knight may own to the precise manner in which meals are to be eaten in silence, and, more importantly, writes them a justification. In a treatise titled In Praise of the New Knighthood, he resolves the theological contradiction that should have doomed the entire project before it began. Killing an enemy of Christ, he argues, is not homicide at all. It is malicide, the killing not of a man, but of the evil the man represents. A Templar who dies in this work does not merely avoid sin. He earns paradise directly, the way a monk earns it through prayer, except faster and with a sword. It is, by any reasonable theological standard of 1129, a radical argument. It is also, for the 9 men who have spent the last decade in relative obscurity, transformative. At the Council of Troyes that same year, the Church formally recognizes the order. Donations that had trickled in as isolated gestures of piety become, almost overnight, a flood: land in France, land in England, land across the breadth of Christian Europe, given by nobles eager to associate themselves with an institution that Bernard of Clairvaux himself has personally vouched for. Within a decade, the men who once dug quietly beneath a mosque in Jerusalem will command more real estate than most kings, and real estate, as it happens, is only the beginning of what they are about to acquire. Part 2. Soldiers who became bankers. Somewhere around the year 1150, a pilgrim preparing to leave Europe for the Holy Land faces a problem that has killed more travelers than any Muslim army ever managed. How do you carry a fortune across a continent without every bandit between London and Jerusalem knowing exactly where to find it? The solution, worked out by an order of monks who took a vow of personal poverty, is almost embarrassingly elegant. The pilgrim walks into a Templar house, a preceptory, in the order's own terminology. In Paris or London, or anywhere else the Templars have by now established a presence, and deposits his silver. In return, he receives not a bag of coins to guard for the next several thousand miles, but a document. A coded letter, its contents meaningless to anyone without the order's own cipher, recording the value of what he has left behind. He carries paper instead of treasure, should he be robbed on the road, and the roads remain exactly as dangerous as they were when 9 knights first swore to protect them. The thief gains nothing. The letter is worthless to anyone but its intended recipient, redeemable only at another Templar house, verified against records that exist in a network stretching from the Atlantic coast to the banks of the Jordan River. It is, by any reasonable definition, the first international banking system Europe has seen since the fall of Rome. The genius of the arrangement is not the invention of credit itself. The basic concept of a promise to pay predates the Templars by centuries. The genius is trust, engineered at an institutional scale that no merchant family, however wealthy, could independently replicate. A private banker can go bankrupt, flee, or simply die, taking his depositors' fortunes with him. An order that spans the length of Christendom, whose reputation is built on 2 centuries of monastic vows and battlefield sacrifice, whose members answer to no crown and can be excommunicated for personal dishonesty, offers something a private lender cannot: institutional permanence. You do not deposit your gold with a Templar, you deposit it with the temple itself, an entity considerably harder to rob, bribe, or intimidate than any individual man. King's notice. King John of England, not a monarch generally remembered for either financial discipline or trustworthiness, at one point deposits 40,000 marks with the order, an almost inconceivable sum for the period, representing a substantial fraction of the crown's available wealth, placed in the hands of an institution John does not control and cannot compel. By the 13th century, the practice extends even to the Vatican. Papal tax collections gathered from across Christian Europe are routed through the Templar house in Paris to settle the Church's own debts, the Pope himself finding it more convenient to trust the temple's ledgers than his own treasury's transport arrangements. The order does not stop at deposits and transfers. It begins to lend, to nobles funding crusades, to kings managing wars, to anyone with sufficient collateral and sufficient need, developing along the way something close to a modern surety bond, in which the Templars themselves guarantee a debtor's obligations to a third party, their own institutional credibility standing in for collateral a lender might otherwise find impossible to verify or seize. They manage estates for absent crusaders. They hold entire fortunes in trust for men who leave for the Holy Land with explicit instructions for what should happen to their wealth if they never return. The historian Dan Jones records one such arrangement plainly. Some men, before departing, left everything with the temple, brothers who would carry out their final wishes if the road to Jerusalem became the last road they ever traveled. None of this wealth technically belongs to any individual Templar. The rule that Bernard of Clairvaux wrote in 1129 remains on paper, unchanged. Poverty, obedience, chastity, the same austere vows sworn by the original 9. A knight of the Temple owns nothing personally, not his sword, not his horse, not the clothes on his back, all of it the property of the order rather than the man. But the order collectively, precisely because none of its members can accumulate private fortunes to squander, becomes one of the wealthiest institutions in the medieval world. Castles, ships, a private fleet substantial enough that historians still debate exactly how large it grew, land holdings across virtually every kingdom in Western Europe, and at the center of it all, a financial network moving sums of money that most sovereign treasuries of the period could not match. By the closing years of the 13th century, the Templars answer to no king. They answer formally and exclusively to the Pope, a legal arrangement secured decades earlier that exempts them from local taxation, local courts, and local bishops alike, a privilege that once seemed like a reasonable reward for men who fight and bleed for Christendom's furthest frontier. It will look, to at least one king watching from Paris, considerably less reasonable once the frontier itself disappears. In 1291, the last Crusader stronghold on the Syrian coast, the city of Acre, falls to the Mamluks. The Holy Land the Templars were founded to defend no longer contains a single foot of Christian territory. The order that built an empire of finance in service of a war now has, for the first time in its existence, no war left to fight. What it still has untouched, unresolved, sitting in strong boxes and ledgers across an entire continent, is the money. Part 3. A kingdom in debt. In June of 1306, King Philip IV of France is forced to hide inside the Paris Temple, the fortified headquarters of the Knights Templar, from a mob of his own subjects. The immediate cause is money, or rather, the lack of it. Philip has spent the better part of 2 decades fighting wars he cannot fully afford, a long grinding conflict with England over territory in the southwest, a humiliating defeat to Flemish rebels at the Battle of the Golden Spurs in 1302, and the eventual costly victory that follows it. None of it comes cheap, and Philip, unable to raise sufficient revenue through taxation alone, has repeatedly done what medieval kings do when the treasury runs dry. He debases the currency, quietly reducing the actual silver content of coins, while insisting they remain legal tender at full face value. By 1306, this manipulation has stripped nearly 2/3 of the real value out of money circulating in his own kingdom. The people of Paris understand currency manipulation better than any king might prefer. When Philip attempts to correct course, reissuing coins at their proper silver weight and demanding landlords accept payment accordingly, the practical effect is that ordinary debts suddenly cost far more to repay than borrowers had expected. Riots break out across the city. A mob descends on the house of Etienne Barbet, a royal officer associated with the currency schemes, and tears it apart. Philip, the anointed King of France, has nowhere safer to go than the one fortress in Paris that no mob would dare attack, the temple headquarters of an order that answers to no crown, protected by its own reputation and its own walls. He and his household remain inside for several days. According to at least one contemporary account, they manage, even amid a national financial crisis triggered substantially by the king's own decisions, to consume 806 pounds of bread and over 2,000 litres of wine during their stay, a detail historians have noted less for its precision than for what it suggests about the mismatch between the king's private appetites and his kingdom's actual finances. It is worth sitting briefly with the specific irony of this moment. The man who will spend the following year systematically destroying the Knights Templar first sought their protection, ate their bread, drank their wine, and slept behind their walls, because there was nowhere else in his own capital he could feel safe. The debt itself is not new. As early as 1286, Philip already owes the order a sum equivalent to roughly 1/6 of France's entire annual revenue, a figure he manages, with some difficulty, to repay the following year, only for renewed war spending through the 1290s to send the crown back into the temple's debt almost immediately. The Templars are, by this point, not merely one lender among several. They are the institution the French crown turns to first, precisely because no one else commands comparable liquidity, comparable trustworthiness, or comparable geographic reach. This dependency itself becomes, over time, its own kind of problem, The Templars answer to the Pope, not to Philip. Their vast holdings across France, castles, farms, entire towns in some cases, sit outside the reach of royal taxation and royal courts alike, protected by decades-old papal privilege. A king drowning in debt to an organization he cannot tax, cannot fully control, and cannot simply order to forgive what he owes is a king with a problem that ordinary statecraft does not obviously solve. Philip has, by 3306, already demonstrated what he is willing to do about debts he would rather not repay. That same year, he expels every Jewish resident of France, seizing their property and their outstanding loans as crown assets in the process, a financial windfall disguised, as such actions of the period generally were, in the language of religious purification rather than fiscal desperation. Not long after, Italian bankers from Lombardy, another major source of royal credit, find themselves subjected to the same treatment: arrest, expulsion, confiscation. Two of the crown's largest creditor groups eliminated within the same handful of years, their assets flowing directly into a treasury that badly needs them. The pattern, once visible, is difficult to unsee. Philip does not merely tax his subjects to fund his wars. He identifies which of his creditors are, for reasons of religion or nationality or legal status, sufficiently isolated from broader French society to be destroyed without triggering the kind of unified resistance that might otherwise follow an attack on the crown's own bankers. The Jews of France had no army. The Lombard merchants had no fortress. The Knights Templar have both. What they do not have by 1307 is a war to justify either, no Holy Land left to defend, no crusading purpose left to shield them from the uncomfortable question. A king in debt might eventually ask about any creditor wealthy enough to matter and isolated enough to attack. The order that once sheltered Philip from his own rioting subjects is, without quite realizing it, next in a line that has already claimed two other targets. The only thing still missing is a plan specific enough and secret enough to make certain the temple never sees it coming. Part 4. The plan written in secret. The man who designs the destruction of the Knights Templar has already once before laid hands on a pope. Guillaume de Nogaret is a lawyer by training, methodical by temperament, and entirely without the scruples that might otherwise slow a man down. 4 years before the Templars occupy his attention, Nogaret orchestrates one of the most audacious acts of the entire medieval period, a raid on the papal palace at Anagni, where Pope Boniface VIII, Philip's bitter enemy in a years-long struggle over whether kings or popes hold ultimate authority in Christendom, is seized, beaten, and very nearly forced to resign at the point of a sword. Local townspeople free the pope before Nogaret can finish what he started. Boniface dies weeks later, reportedly never fully recovering from the humiliation. Nogaret, rather than facing consequences, receives property and advancement. This is the man Philip now sets to work on a considerably larger target. The specific complaint that gives Nogaret his opening arrives conveniently from within the order itself. A disaffected former Templar, accounts of exactly who and why vary, brings accusations of heresy and misconduct to royal attention, providing precisely the pretext a king who owes the temple a fortune could use to justify what he has already decided to do. Whether the complaint reflects genuine wrongdoing or simply gives Nogaret raw material to work with is a question historians still debate. What is not in dispute is how quickly and how thoroughly the accusation is developed into a full legal case. On September 14, 1307, sealed letters leave the royal chancery in Paris, addressed to bailiffs and seneschals in every corner of the kingdom. The letters are not to be opened until a specific date, still weeks away. Accompanying them is a personal message from Philip himself, florid, sorrowful in tone, describing at length how heart-rending it is for a Christian king to be compelled by duty to take such drastic action. Even as the same document lays out, in granular administrative detail, precisely how the coming operation is to be conducted. Historians examining the letter's tone have noted the peculiar effect it must have produced on the officials who first broke its seal, grief and bureaucratic precision occupying the same paragraph. The charges Nogaret has assembled, meanwhile, read like a checklist of every fear medieval Christendom could summon about a secret society operating in its midst. Denial of Christ during initiation, spitting on the cross, obscene kisses exchanged between new members and their superiors, sodomy tolerated if not required, And at the center of it all, a mysterious idol the confessions will eventually call Baphomet, worshipped, supposedly, in ceremonies from which outsiders were always excluded. Exactly the kind of secrecy that looks like innocent monastic discipline right up until someone decides it looks like something else. None of these accusations have, as of September 1307, been tested by a single day of investigation. That is, from Novgorod's perspective, rather the point the letters go out before any evidence exists, because the operation's success depends entirely on synchronization, and synchronization depends on secrecy holding for a full month across every province in France. It holds on October 12th. The day before the operation is set to begin, Jacques de Molay, Grand Master of the Temple, the most powerful Templar alive, a man who has spent the past several years lobbying popes and kings for support for a new crusade he still genuinely believes is possible, travels to Paris. His reason for being in the city on this particular date has nothing to do with any premonition of danger. He is there to attend a funeral. Catherine, wife of Charles de Valois, the king's own brother. De Molay walks among the mourners as an honored guest, a man trusted enough to be included in the royal family's private grief, entirely unaware that the king receiving his condolences has already signed the order for his arrest. He spends that night at the Paris Temple, the same fortress where Philip once sheltered from his own rioting subjects, the same walls that fed a king bread and wine he could not afford. It is, by any measure, the safest building in France for a Templar to sleep in. At dawn, that will no longer be true for anyone. Part 5, Friday the 13th. At first light on October 13th, 13007, royal officers across France break down doors that, until this exact moment, no secular authority had ever had the right to touch. The scale of the operation is, by the standards of medieval statecraft, almost unimaginable. Every Templar commandery in the kingdom, from the grand fortress in Paris down to the smallest rural preceptory, is stormed within the same handful of hours by men who have been holding sealed orders for a full month without a single leak, reaching the order they are about to destroy. Historians studying the operation have called it a masterpiece of medieval administrative coordination, and they mean this almost literally. Nothing on this scale, requiring this degree of simultaneous secrecy across an entire kingdom, had been attempted before. At the Paris Temple, the doors give way to reveal Jacques de Molay still inside the same walls where he slept the night before, the same fortress that once sheltered a rioting Paris from itself, now offering no protection at all to the man who leads it. He is arrested along with every Templar the royal agents can find within the building. Across the country, the story repeats itself with only minor variation. At some smaller houses, a handful of knights manage to slip away in the confusion, hidden by sympathetic locals or simple administrative gaps in Philip's otherwise remarkable planning. Most do not. By the end of the day, an order that spent nearly 2 centuries answering to no one but the Pope finds itself entirely in the custody of a king it does not answer to at all. Philip's men move immediately to the temple's treasury in Paris. The vault, that by every reasonable assumption ought to contain a fortune vast enough to erase the crown's debts several times over, they find it largely empty. Whether this reflects a genuine warning that reached the order in its final days, a routine transfer of funds that happened to precede the raid by pure coincidence, or simply exaggerated expectations about how much cash a lending institution actually keeps sitting in a vault rather than out on loan, no surviving record fully explains. What is certain is that the immediate financial windfall Philip presumably hoped for does not materialize the way the operation's scale might suggest it should. The wealth he is after turns out to be tied up in land, in property, in obligations that will take years of legal maneuvering to actually convert into royal revenue, which is in its own way a detail that undercuts the tidy narrative of a king simply reaching into an overflowing vault and helping himself. What Philip does have, immediately and without qualification, is the men. The charges Novgorod has spent months preparing are read aloud across the kingdom in language designed less to establish legal fact than to produce visceral horror in anyone who hears it. A bitter thing, the king's own proclamation calls it, a lamentable thing, a thing horrible to contemplate, terrible to hear of, an escalating litany of adjectives that arrives before a single Templar has been formally tried, before a single piece of evidence has been examined by anyone other than the men who invented the accusation in the first place. And the public reaction when it comes is not what 2 centuries of Templar prestige might have led anyone to expect. There is no uprising in their defense. No crowd gathers to demand the release of men who were, until this Friday morning, considered among the most respected warriors in Christendom, heroes of the Crusades, protectors of pilgrims, an order Pope Boniface VIII himself had praised as fearless warriors of Christ barely a decade earlier. The silence is, in its way, as remarkable as the arrests themselves. Perhaps it reflects genuine shock too large to process quickly. Perhaps it reflects something less flattering: 2 centuries of watching the Templars answer to no local law, pay no local tax, and grow wealthier than the nobles who lived beside their walls had already primed ordinary French subjects to feel less sympathy than the order might once have assumed it had earned. Whatever the explanation, Philip has calculated correctly. The men with the fortress and the reputation and the 2-century legacy have just been arrested by a king who, less than a decade and a half earlier, was hiding from an angry mob behind their own walls, and no one in France is coming to help them. The only person with any formal authority to object is currently in Avignon, and he has not yet been told what has already happened in his name. Part 6. What torture produced? The interrogations begin within days, and they do not begin gently. Medieval inquisitorial procedure permits torture in cases of suspected heresy, and the methods available to Philip's interrogators in the autumn of 1007 are the standard repertoire of the age. The strappado, in which a prisoner's arms are bound behind his back before he is hoisted by rope and dropped, dislocating shoulders under his own body weight. The rack, which stretches joints past their natural limits, fire applied directly to the soles of bound feet, sometimes for so long that the bones themselves are later reported charred. Surviving trial records reference these methods only obliquely, scribal notes mentioning injuries, missing teeth, feet requiring amputation after questioning, but the pattern across hundreds of individual confessions is difficult to read as anything other than what it plainly is. By the time the first wave of interrogations concludes, 138 Templars in Paris alone have confessed to some version of the charges against them. Jacques de Molay is among them. On October 24th and 25th, under questioning by royal agents at the University of Paris, the Grand Master of an order that had commanded armies and financed kings admits, according to the record kept by the men torturing him, to denying Christ during his initiation decades earlier, and to spitting near a cross, though notably not directly upon it, a distinction he apparently insists on even under duress. He denies, at this stage, the charges of sodomy. He then does something that will haunt every subsequent Templar trial across Europe. He writes a letter in his own hand, urging every other member of the order to confess exactly as he has. Whether de Molay believes cooperation will save his brothers, or whether he has simply been broken past the point of calculation, no one can say with certainty. What is certain is the effect. A confession from an ordinary knight might be dismissed as the product of pain and desperation. A confession from the Grand Master himself, actively encouraging others to follow his example, becomes something considerably harder for the wider world to wave away. The specific content of what these confessions produce reads, to modern eyes, like a catalogue assembled from every fear medieval Christendom could summon about a closed, secretive brotherhood. Denial of Christ, trampling or spitting on the crucifix during initiation, obscene kisses exchanged between new members and their superiors on the mouth, on the navel, in some versions on parts of the body. The surviving records describe with visible scribal discomfort. Sodomy, tolerated as an obligation between brothers rather than a private sin. And at the center of the most sensational accusations, an idol the confessions increasingly call Baphomet, a bearded head, sometimes said to be made of metal, sometimes described as containing human remains, worshipped in ceremonies from which any outsider was always excluded. The royal custodian eventually assigned to search the Paris temple for physical evidence of this idol, a man named Guillaume Pidoyer, spends several weeks looking. What he finds in the end is a single silver gilt head of a woman, hollow, containing fragments of a skull wrapped in linen, identified, according to accompanying documentation, as a relic connected to one of 11,000 virgin martyrs, a common enough category of medieval religious relic that bears no resemblance whatsoever to the bearded idol described in the confessions. Nothing else is ever produced in any court on either side of the investigation. 200 years of accumulated Templar wealth and property, searched by a king with every incentive to find something damning, yields exactly one object that does not even match what the confessions describe. News of the arrests reaches Pope Clement V in Avignon. and his reaction is not what Philip might have hoped for. The Templars answer by ancient and explicit papal privilege to Rome alone. No king, however powerful, has any legal standing to arrest them, try them, or seize their property without the Pope's explicit authorization. Authorization Philip never requested and Clement never granted. The Pope is, by every surviving account, genuinely furious at what amounts to an open assault on his own authority. A French king simply seizing an institution that belongs, in every meaningful legal sense, to the Church rather than the Crown. But Clement V is not an independent actor in any sense that matters here. He is a former French bishop, elected to the papacy in no small part through Philip's own influence, currently residing not in Rome but in Avignon, inside French territory, surrounded by French soil, dependent on French goodwill for the physical safety of his own office. His predecessor, Boniface VIII, tried standing up to this same king and ended up beaten in his own palace, dead within weeks of the humiliation. Clement has had years to absorb the lesson that Boniface apparently learned too late. His anger, whatever its sincerity, has nowhere useful to go. Part 7. The Pope Who Couldn't Refuse. In August of 1308, in the castle at Chinon, Pope Clement V does something that will remain entirely unknown to the world for nearly 700 years. Meeting privately with Jacques de Molay and the order's other senior leaders, kept isolated from the wider Templar trials proceeding elsewhere, held at a royal castle rather than any papal facility, in an arrangement Philip has quietly engineered to keep them exactly where his own men can control access to them. Clement's own legates hear the Grand Master recant. Under direct papal questioning, away from the interrogators who extracted his earlier confession, de Molay describes irregularities, troubling lapses in ceremony, practices that should not have been permitted. He does not describe heresy. Clement's representatives, after days of hearings, issue a formal absolution. The Templar leadership is cleared of the charge that actually mattered, restored to full communion with the Church. This document, later known as the Chinon Parchment, will not surface again until the year 2001, when the historian Barbara Frail discovers it misfiled in the Vatican's own archives, apparently shelved in the wrong location, sometime around 1628, and simply forgotten for the better part of 4 centuries. For nearly 700 years, the historical consensus holds that Clement V condemned the Templars as heretics from the outset. The parchment proves otherwise. The Pope absolved them privately and then never told anyone. Why a Pope would grant absolution and then bury the document that proves it is not? On reflection, much of a mystery. Clement understands his position with total clarity. He is not simply managing a legal case. He is managing a king who has already demonstrated, against Clement's own predecessor, exactly what happens to a pope who refuses him, beaten in his own palace, dead within weeks of the humiliation. Philip has made clear through channels both diplomatic and considerably less diplomatic that continued resistance carries consequences extending well beyond strongly worded letters. The Pope summons a general council to meet at Vienne, ostensibly to settle the Templar question once and for all through proper ecclesiastical process. The choice of location is itself a small act of resistance. Vienne sits outside Philip's direct territorial control, a detail Clement clearly hopes will preserve at least the appearance of independent judgment. It does not survive contact with the king in person. The council convenes in October 1311, drawing 20 cardinals, 4 patriarchs, roughly 100 archbishops and bishops from across Christendom, a genuine ecclesiastical body, and one that, when it finally takes up the Templar question, arrives at a conclusion Philip has spent 4 years working to prevent. A majority of the assembled churchmen determined that the evidence gathered so far, produced substantially through torture and contradicted by the order's own private absolution at Chinon, simply does not meet the standard required to condemn an entire order for heresy. The matter is tabled. The council, functioning as intended, is prepared to let the Templars survive. Philip does not wait to see whether this holds. In March of 1312 he arrives at Vienne in person, accompanied, according to multiple contemporary accounts, by a substantial portion of his own army, which makes camp outside the city walls while the king himself takes a seat inside the council chamber. No formal threat needs to be spoken aloud. A clerk announces for the benefit of the assembled churchmen that anyone who rises to address the Templar question without explicit permission will be excommunicated on the spot, a warning that ensures the debate a majority of the council had wanted to continue simply does not happen. Within 2 days of the king's arrival, Clement calls a private meeting with a smaller commission of cardinals who vote 4/5 in favor to dissolve the order entirely. The bull that results, Vox in Excelso, is a masterpiece of careful non-commitment. Clement does not declare the Templars guilty of heresy. He does not uphold the confessions extracted under torture, many of which the order's own leaders had quietly recanted at Chinon 4 years earlier. He suppresses the order, instead by what the document itself calls apostolic provision, an administrative act, not a legal verdict, justified by the damage the accusations have already done to the order's reputation, regardless of whether any of them are actually true. It is, stripped of the Latin formality, a pope publicly killing an institution he has privately absolved, because the alternative is a fight he has already watched one predecessor lose fatally. The order's vast holdings, at least in principle, are ordered transferred to a rival organization, the Knights Hospitaller, a redistribution that on paper denies Philip the windfall he originally sought. In France specifically, the king finds ways to ensure a considerable portion never actually leaves his own hands. What remains unresolved, as the council concludes in May of 1312, is not the order's fate. That has been decided, whatever the private truth buried in an unpublished parchment. What remains unresolved is the fate of the men, Jacques de Molay chief among them, still sitting in a French prison, absolved by the Pope in secret, condemned by the same Pope in public, waiting for a king who has not yet decided he is finished with them. Part 8. The Fire at Notre-Dame. For nearly 2 more years after the Council of Vienne concludes, Jacques de Molay remains exactly where Philip has kept him. In a French prison, his case unresolved, his fate suspended between a private papal absolution nobody outside a small circle knows exists, and a public dissolution the entire Christian world has already witnessed. The Pope, despite repeated demands from de Molay himself for a hearing, does not act. 3 cardinals are eventually dispatched to Paris in December 1313, arriving the following March with what everyone involved understands will be a final, irrevocable verdict. On March 18, 1314, de Molay and 3 other senior Templar leaders are brought before a public platform erected on the square outside Notre-Dame Cathedral to hear the cardinals formally pronounce their sentence: perpetual imprisonment. Not execution, not further torture. A life sentence, harsh but survivable, for men already old, already broken by 7 years of confinement. 2 of the 4 men accept this in silence. Hugues de Perrot and Geoffroy de Gonneville, worn down past the point of resistance, say nothing that contradicts the verdict. Jacques de Molay does not, whatever combination of exhaustion, faith and simple refusal moves him in this moment. The 70-year-old former Grand Master interrupts the cardinal's proceedings in front of the assembled crowd. He declares, loudly enough for the square to hear, that everything he confessed under torture 7 years earlier was a lie extracted through pain and the fear of death. The order, he insists, is innocent, pure, holy. He would rather die than let another false confession stand as the final word on 2 centuries of his brother's service. Geoffroy de Charny, preceptor of Normandy, standing beside him, does the same. It is, in the most literal sense, the worst possible moment for either man to have chosen this. A confession, however coerced, that is later retracted, transforms a repentant heretic into what canon law calls a relapsed heretic, someone who has confessed, been offered mercy, and then rejected it by reasserting the very guilt the confession supposedly absolved. Relapsed heretics do not receive imprisonment. They receive the stake, and there is no further appeal available once the designation applies. News of what has just happened in the square reaches Philip at the Louvre almost immediately. He does not wait for further proceedings, further consultation, further anything. Bypassing every remaining formality of the legal process his own agents spent 7 years constructing, he orders both men burned that same evening, before nightfall, before anyone, including, conspicuously, the cardinals who had just pronounced a considerably lighter sentence, can intervene. Pyres go up on an island in the Seine. Some accounts specify the Ile de Javio, others the western tip of the Ile de la Cité, directly in view of the cathedral itself. As dusk settles and the canons of Notre-Dame begin lighting candles and incense for evening vespers, the fires are set. Multiple contemporary accounts agree that de Molay faces his death without visible fear, and several describe a specific deliberate request, that his hands be bound in front of him rather than behind, so that he might hold them together in prayer as the flames rise, and that he be positioned facing the cathedral itself as he dies. What he says in his final moments has been recorded in at least 2 distinct versions, and historians examining both have generally concluded that the more famous one owes more to legend than to any contemporary witness. The version with actual documentary support, recorded closer to the event, has him declaring something considerably more restrained than legend prefers. God knows who is wrong and who has sinned. Calamity will soon come to those who have condemned us unjustly. The version everyone actually remembers is more specific, more theatrical, and almost certainly assembled generations after the fact. That de Molay, from inside the flames, personally summoned both Pope Clement V and King Philip IV to face divine judgment within the year, a curse precise enough to name both men and specific enough to set a deadline. What happened next is not legend, it is simply what happened. Clement V dies on April 20, 1314, a little over a month after the execution, from an illness that had, by most accounts, already been advancing for some time, unconnected to any supernatural intervention by any reasonable medical standard. Philip IV survives him by less than 8 months, dying on November 29th of the same year, following what chroniclers describe as a stroke suffered while hunting, at just 46 years old, in apparent good health, until the moment he collapsed. 2 men, both centrally responsible for the destruction of an order that had stood for nearly 2 centuries, both dead within the same calendar year, the order's last Grand Master burned on the Seine. Whether de Molay actually spoke the words later generations attributed to him matters, in the end considerably less than the fact that history obliged the legend anyway, and that the coincidence, real or embellished, was compelling enough to outlive every eyewitness who might have corrected the record. Aftermath. The wealth that Philip spent 7 years trying to seize does not in the end simply vanish into his treasury, the way the arrest scale might suggest it should. Pope Clement's bull ordering Templar assets transferred to the Knights Hospitaller, a rival military order that survived the purge entirely intact, having never attracted the same royal debt or royal suspicion, is largely honored, if imperfectly, across most of Christian Europe. Hospitaller commanderies absorb former Templar properties, former Templar income, in some cases former Templar knights themselves, quietly reassigned to a different white mantle bearing a different cross. In France specifically, Philip finds ways to ensure a considerable portion of the transferred wealth passes through his own hands first: administrative fees, transition costs, expenses that somehow consume a substantial fraction of what was supposed to move directly to the Hospitallers. He does not get everything he originally hoped for. He does not walk away empty-handed either. In Portugal, the story takes a stranger turn. King Denis refuses to participate in the persecution his fellow monarchs across Europe have largely gone along with under papal and French pressure. Rather than disbanding his kingdom's Templars, he simply renames them, the Order of Christ, founded in 1319, absorbing the former Templars of Tomar wholesale, inheriting their property, their fortress, in some meaningful sense their entire institutional continuity, under a new name that satisfies the letter of Clement's dissolution while ignoring its spirit almost entirely. Vasco da Gama will later sail under the Order of Christ's Cross. Portuguese ships will carry it to Africa, to Brazil, to the furthest edges of the known world for centuries after the original Templars supposedly ceased to exist. The myth-making begins almost immediately and has never really stopped. Within decades, unverifiable stories circulate about Templar knights who escaped the 1307 arrests entirely. A preceptor named Gerard de Villiers, warned just in time, supposedly fleeing with 50 horses and 18 galleys loaded with the order's treasure and, in some tellings, its darkest secrets, disappearing into a historical record that conveniently offers no way to confirm or disprove any of it. Centuries later, 18th century Freemasonry begins incorporating Templar imagery and terminology into its own ceremonial degrees: the Knight of the Temple, elaborate rituals invoking a lineage the historical Templars would not have recognized. Whether any genuine institutional connection exists between the medieval order and Freemasonry remains, among serious historians, essentially settled. It does not. The connection is ceremonial invention, adopted centuries after the fact, not inherited bloodline. None of this has meaningfully slowed the story's momentum. A 1989 book called Born in Blood popularized the Templar to Freemason theory for a mass audience. Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code, in 2003, did something similar for an entire generation's understanding of Rosslyn Chapel, the Holy Grail, and a supposed unbroken line running from Jerusalem in 1119 to a Scottish chapel 8 centuries later. Nicolas Cage has searched for Templar treasure on the big screen. Video game franchises have built entire fictional wars around the Order's supposed secret survival. The historical Templars, according to at least one Cardiff University medievalist who has spent a career studying the actual archival record, were, in her own words, extremely boring Roman Catholics. The legend has never been interested in boring. And here, at the end, is the detail most people watching this video will find hardest to believe. The date itself, Friday, October 13th, 1307, did not make Friday the 13th unlucky. There is no meaningful written evidence connecting the two before the 20th century. Geoffrey Chaucer calls Friday an unlucky day for beginning journeys in the 14th century, but says nothing about the Templars specifically. References to the number 13 as ominous predate 1307 by centuries, rooted in older mathematical and mythological traditions entirely unconnected to any French king or any burned Grand Master. The specific belief that Friday the 13th, as a combined date, carries bad luck does not become a documented cultural phenomenon until the late 1800s and does not explode into mass popular consciousness until a 1907 American novel that has nothing whatsoever to do with medieval France. The link to the Templars, specifically, the version nearly everyone now assumes is simply historical fact, was popularized decades later still, largely through the same 1989 book and the same Dan Brown novel that spread the Freemasonry myth. In other words, the single most famous fact almost everyone thinks they know about this story. The reason the date itself supposedly still gives people a small superstitious chill was invented by novelists roughly 700 years after the fire went out on the Seine. Jacques de Molay did not curse a superstition into existence. He was simply unlucky enough to die on a date that a very different century, for reasons that had nothing to do with him, eventually decided to fear anyway. This has been Aphelion. If you like videos like this, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. You'll find videos about the final moments of other famous people and more. Feel free to leave a comment. I'll read and reply to each one. Your engagement means a lot to me. Thank you for your attention. Goodbye.